Welcome everybody to the Sunday Feast. We are here today at Commonwealth Avenue. We are also here today on Zoom. And if you're finding us later, you might find us on YouTube, in which case, let us know if you have any questions. Leave it in the chat, leave it in the comments, or we'll be taking some questions near the end. But for today, we're going to change it up a little bit. And we're going to read from Chaitanya Charitamrita. Kind of a roundabout way to the Gita. We usually do the Gita on Sunday Feast. But given that we're in like an avatar season, let's say, we have Ram Navami, we have Purnima, we have the Shingadev's appearance day coming up soon. Those in the Christian countries are celebrating Easter today. So this presence of God in the world is sort of in the air. And it does, it continues into the spring, into the summer. We have Krishna Janmashtami, Balaram Jayanti, Radhastami. We have pastimes like Bhagavad Puja and Diwali. And all of these are really connected to the incarnations of the Lord. And that presence that God has, that interest that God takes when engaging in the material world. So, Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Dora Jaya 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 Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Dora Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Dora Hare Krishna. So what we're diving into here is in the Madhya Lila, the 20th chapter, and what it is and why it's important and why it's a good entry point for us today when we're here together to actually discuss this topic of avatars. And we gave the title of the Krishna is the source of astonishing avatars. And we'll also see how astonishment has a connection to the avatars. And so really what we're in right now is we are in a story where Sanatana Goswami has had a very, let's say, relatable experience to many of us in the world. Sanatana Goswami was engaged in ministerial affairs. He had a job, government job, and he had met Lord Chaitanya and was like, sort of wanted to be a devotee so bad. And really what it did is he decided to take his version of medical leave from his government job to hear and chant. And he was doing that, but the government officials, well, and he wrote a letter and said, I'm so sick, I can't do this anymore. I really need to take some time. Here's my notice. Please don't ask me for anything. And that was his way of trying to get out of it without actually like quitting the job. And when the government officials had heard about that, they sort of checked on him. They said, well, you okay? And they saw him like hearing and chanting and sort of deeply involved in meditation and becoming a devotee. And they really freaked out and said, what are you doing? This is not what you would, but this is actually my real sickness. And I actually want to be a devotee. And so they threw him in prison for that. And there's a story where he is able to get out of prison with the help of his brother and other related associates and try to make his way to Lord Chaitanya. And so he's gone through all of these trials and tribulations, only to show up at Lord Chaitanya, at the door where Lord Chaitanya was staying. And Lord Chaitanya knew he was there. Go outside and see, there's someone outside, a great Vaishnava. No, my Lord, there's only a mendicant, almost like a homeless person. He described him as a mendicant, maybe a Muslim, maybe he's a mendicant. There's someone out there, it's not this great Vaishnava. And he said, no, bring him in, bring him in. So he brought him in and immediately they recognized each other and had this amazing exchange. Lord Chaitanya sent him to go get cleaned up, but then come back. And then they had these 10 days of discussions in which this conversation takes place. And we're going to dive into this conversation. And so what this conversation is, and it's really makes up the foundational work of one of Prabhupada's first books that he published. So it was a Krishna book, Bhagavad Gita, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, Ishopanishad. And this conversation has become like the foundational text for the Teachings of Lord Chaitanya book that Prabhupada published. So what I've done with the conversation is that's okay. Thank you. Actually, is there some papers on that? Can I just grab those as well? Thank you so much. So the conversation that we're diving into is this conversation. We're finally there together. And I've curated the texts in here that really elucidate the incarnations. And now the conversation goes in many different ways. And that's why, in a sense, it's a very good companion study to the Bhagavad Gita, because it has a lot of connected ontological philosophy that basically is the core of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And in terms of like the identity and who is God and how is God connected. And within that, he's describing the incarnation. So what I've done is I've sort of taken some of those verses. So we can stick to the script. We can see it's going to have a flow, only really focusing on the verses that have to do with the incarnations and how it's all connected. And just like anything, I think, it's like almost appropriate to begin with prayer. And Sanatana Goswami begins with this prayer, But I'm going to read from Prabhupada's introduction to that prayer, because Prabhupada sort of gives a concise version of that prayer. So finally, they're together. Sanatana Goswami says, at that time, Sanatana fell at the seat. So this is from chapter 3, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. At that time, Sanatana fell at the feet of the Lord and with great humility asked about his own real identity. And he says, I am born of a lower family, Sanatana said. My associations are all abominable, and I am fallen, the most wretched of mankind. I was suffering in the dark well of material enjoyment, and I never knew the actual goal of my life. Indeed, I do not even know what is beneficial for me. Although I am what is known in the world as a great learned man, I am in fact so much of a fool that I myself even think that I am learned. You have accepted me as your servant, and you have delivered me from the entanglement of material life. Now please tell me, what is my duty in this liberated state? And so that's the entry point in which they begin this conversation. And so Lord Chaitanya, his response to that is actually, you are fit to propagate the cult of devotional service, therefore gradually hear all the truths about it from me now, and I'll tell you about them. And it's an interesting thing because he explains that since you possess Lord Krishna's potency, you certainly know these things. However, it's the nature of a sadhu to inquire. Although he knows these things, a sadhu inquires for the sake of strictness. And so really, this is about Vaishnavas associating, ultimately. It is instructional, but at the same time, it's what devotees do when they come together. Is actually have Bhagavad Gita and how is this working, and they engage in sort of this dialogue, really asking questions and sharing realizations. That's what this becomes. And just like such, with this Bhagavad Gita, we'll find that in this conversation, Lord Chaitanya doesn't entirely elucidate philosophy, but he simply is quoting from a bunch of different scriptures. And so we'll actually hear a bit from those different scriptures about that. So this is Lord Chaitanya quoting the Vishnu Purana. Just as the illumination of fire, which is situated in one place, is spread all over, the energies of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Param Brahman, are spread all over this universe. You should know that Krishna, as the original soul of all Atmas, living entities, for the benefit of the whole universe, he has, out of his causeless mercy, appeared as an ordinary human being. He has done this with the strength of his own eternal potency. So, O Sanatana, please hear about the eternal form of the Lord. He is the absolute truth, devoid of duality, but present in Vrindavan as the son of Nanda Maharaj. Krishna is the original source of everything and is the sum total of everything. He appears as the supreme youth, and his whole body is comprised of spiritual bliss. He is the shelter of everything and the master of everyone. And then Prabhupada has a purport here where he describes really that Krishna is the original source of all the Vishnu tamas. So that really when we're talking about Vishnu, also we're talking about Krishna, and that Krishna is emanating these Vishnus. Mahavishnu, Garbhodakashaya Vishnu, Kshirodakashaya Vishnu, and that these Vishnus, everything emanates from him, and his body is completely spiritual and the source of all spiritual being. So that actually Krishna is also emanating Vishnu, who we often understand even in a greater sense to like we identify Vishnu with the awe and reverence aspect as God. And Krishna is a more difficult aspect to understand as God because Krishna appeared the son of Maharaj Nanda. The original Supreme Personality of Godhead is Krishna. His original name is Govinda. He is full of all opulences, and his eternal abode is known as Goloka Vrindavan. And this is again what Chaitanya quoted. All of these incarnations of Godhead are either plenary portions or parts of the plenary portions of the Purusha avatars. But Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead himself. In every age, he protects the world through his different features when the world is disturbed by the enemies of Indra. And then he quotes the Gita, and he says, but what need is there, Arjuna, for all this detailed knowledge? With a single fragment of myself, I've pervaded and supported this entire universe. So Krishna is even saying, it's very complicated, but actually it's not complicated because every fragment of my being pervades everything. So it's not actually complicated. It sounds complicated. The concept is complicated. It's not complicated when you can understand that God is simply able to do this. Only by devotional activity can one understand the transcendental form of the Lord, which is perfect in all respects. Although his form is one, he can expand his form into unlimited numbers by his supreme will. You think of Upanishad. The Lord is completely perfect and he's perfectly complete, and all emanations that are coming from him, those are also perfectly, completely perfect. Prabhupada gives a purport here. The original form of the Supreme Lord does not depend on the other forms. The original is called the Swayam Rupa. Krishna's to Bhagavan Swayam. Krishna's original form is a cowherd boy in Vrindavan. That's called the Swayam Rupa. Ishvara Parama Krishna Sachidananda Vigraha Anadir Ade Govinda Sarvakarana Karnanda. Krishna is, there's nothing superior to Krishna. There's nothing superior. Krishna is the Ishvara Parama. He again, in this purport, Prabhupada quotes the Ladu Bhagavatamrita, and he talks about the form of the Lord, how it's divided into different categories, and that these different categories all depend on the bodily features of the Lord, that the Lord actually manifests different features. It's still the Lord, but these different categories are simply coming from the different bodily features. The original form of the Lord, he says, the Swayam Rupa is exhibited in two forms, the Swayam Rupa and the Swayam Prakash. His original form is Swayam Rupa. Krishna is observed as the cowherd wearing Vrindavan. He expands his original form into many, as he did during the Ras Leela. So that's an example that he gives, that just like in the Ras Leela, we see that Krishna is expanding into many forms, but from the perspective of the gopis, they're having an individual experience with Krishna. And so they give that example that actually in the Ras Leela, these forms of Krishna are actually just as much Krishna, that each gopi is actually engaged directly with Krishna. The Prabhupada Prakash expansions of the Lord are not like the expansions of Salbhari. Had they been so, Narada would not have been astonished to see them. And so Salbhari was a sage described in the Bhagavatam. And the sage, he used his spiritual prowess, his penance, the yoga bhava, to transform his old withered body into a young, amazing looking person to attract people. And it went from there. And then he created a whole, like, from this yoga power, he was able to manipulate the energy and just have the most beautiful opulent residences. And even the king of the earth at the time, and this is important, his name was Mandati, he was the king of the earth. And it's an important part of this discussion to understand that when we're talking about earth, and we're talking about Bhagavatam, and we're going to talk about these incarnations, it's not actually just 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, or, if we're in the Kali Yuga, we've been in the Kali Yuga for 5,000 years. Previous to this, it was the Dwapara Yuga, 864,000 years. And so that begins to get into deep antiquity about what humans were doing at the time, 864,000 years ago, and what we can find some of the most ancient of our ruins maybe are 17,000 years ago, maybe Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, something like that we find. So that's in the end of Dwapara Yuga, but not encompassing all of Dwapara Yuga. What to speak of Treta Yuga, Ram Leela, a million years ago. If you just count this 432,000 segments, Kali Yuga 432,000, Dwapara Yuga 2 times that amount, Treta Yuga 432,000 times 3, Satya Yuga 432,000 times 4. That comprises this one thing, and then that cycles. And that's all part of one story of humanity, just in this one part of the story. So at that time, this sage impressed this king of the world. And Narada is saying that that's not the same thing. Because what had happened was this sage, his ultimate fall down was he was meditating underwater, but his spiritual prowess had become so much in touch with the material world that he became inspired by the mating of 2 fish. And that became his fall down. It was such a thin veneer of actual spiritual strength at that point that he was just even meditating underwater somehow, the principle. But he fell down because he became too thoughtful and too obsessed with these 2 fish mating. Yeah. And so Narada was not astonished, because this is not that. When the Lord is expanding himself, the Lord is not in contact with the material world. He's not just performing yoga miracles. It's actually a very, very different principle. and which Prabhupada talks about in Nectar of Devotion. And I'll just cut to the chase with it. He says that the activities of a person, even if they're not very extraordinary, create an impression of wonder in the heart and the mind of a person's friend, a person. Mind of a person. Hold on. The activities of a person, even if they are not very extraordinary, create an impression of wonder in the heart and mind of the person's friends. But even very wonderful activities performed by a person who is not one's friend will not create any impression. And it's because of love that one's wonderful activities create this impression in the mind. And so the example here is that Narada had seen Lord Krishna expanded everywhere in Dwarka, engaging everywhere at the same time. And he was astonished, but it's not the same astonishment as seeing that actually, oh, Krishna is performing a trick and somehow he can be many places at once. They were individually Krishna engaging with the devotees. So it's astounding that Lord Krishna, and this is again Lord Chaitanya quoting, it's astounding that Lord Krishna, who is one without a second, expanded himself in 16,000 similar forms to marry 16,000 queens in their respective homes. And Lord Chaitanya explains that if one form or feature is differently manifested according to different emotional features, it's called the Vaibhava Prakash. And when the Lord expands himself in multiple forms, there's no difference in these forms. It's only bodily features, bodily colors, and the weapons. When the Lord is two-handed, he's called Vaibhava Prakash. And when he's four-handed, it's Prabhava Prakash. So these are the two forms that Krishna, that Arjuna requests to see in the Gita. Show me your four-handed form, and also show me your two-handed form. And then Lord Chaitanya goes on to quote Madhava, and he says, "My dear friends, this dramatic actor appears like a second form of my own self, like a picture. He displays my pastimes as a cowherd boy, overflowing with wonderfully attractive sweetness and fragrance." And so Lord Chaitanya explains that when that body is a little differently manifested and its features are a little different in transcendental emotion and form, that's called Tat Ekatma. In Tat Ekatma Rupa, there are pastime expansions, vilasa, personal expansions, svamsa. And according to pastime and personal expansions, these are the various differences that are coming forth. So again, the vilasa forms are divided into two categories, prabhava and vaibhava. Now this, Prabhupada explains in the Bhagavad Gita, it's very complex, but that these forms actually expand into four different forms, the Chaturvyuha, and that this expansion comes forth, Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha, and that these forms, like if you can imagine a machine logic diagram, where like Vishnu, becomes Vishnu, and then these expand, and then these expand into other forms. So then it goes on to show how Vishnu is actually expanding through different expansions, but that this expansion process, Vishnu is always one. Vishnu is never lost to himself. He's not less Vishnu because he's expanding. Krishna is not less Krishna than he's expanding. And Krishna is not different than Vishnu because Krishna is exhibiting Krishna. So he explains that these form 24 forms, which constitute the primary prabhava vilas pastimes of the Lord. They're named differently according to the position of the weapons in their hands. And all of these forms that differ in dress, features are distinguished by vaibhava vilas. And he explains that they'll have their eternal residences in the spiritual sky, that these forms also predominate in the Vaikuntha planets, that they have their own dhams. Thus, the Lord is situated in all the universes in different forms, just to please his devotees. Thus, the Lord destroys irreligious principles and establishes religious principles. Prabhupada says that devotees may take advantage of actually these places in the universe where the Lord is performing these pastimes and go and see Lord Jagannath and Jagannath Puri. Go to Vrindavan, Prayag, Mathura, Haridwar, Vishnu Kanchi. When the devotees travel to these places and they see the Lord, they become very happy in devotional service. And just even as we are getting into Lord Nrsingadeva's appearance day, we can also meditate that there is a place called the Hovalam that we could even visit in this world someday. And I was reminded of this devotee, his name was Dhruva, and he went and he traveled around to visit all the different Nishingadev temples. He was a Shringapanta. And he was a Gurukuli. So he was really young and he came to the Boston Temple for a little bit to stay, but he was traveling through in India. And he wrote a book called The Lost Temples of Nishinga. And it's like, that's what he did for a number of years. But he just went around India and went to find these old places and photograph them. So you can go to Ahovalam, and there's 9 predominating forms of Nishinga and Ahovalam where you can go. So you can make like special pilgrimages. And at these different temples, we have one where, and it's like these places are connected to the Lord's pastimes. So when the Lord's pastimes come to the material world, they're taking place in this material world, but they're not material pastimes. So that connection that they make is an important connection that as bhaktas we can exploit because they're so rich with the Lord's pastimes. And it's almost like they're happening in another dimension on top of what's actually happening there. We can't see it with our material eyes, but we can access it through performing devotional service and hearing and chanting. We can see it through the eyes of kirtan when we're there. So you can go as a pilgrim to these places. And there's a place, a temple, where it was realized that Prahlad was pacifying the Lord, you know, in a connected place like this. There was a place where Lord Nishingadev and Lord Varaha worshiped together in that connected pastime with Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu. And even that connection and the relationship that's established between Vishnu and the Asura lineages through those pastimes. There's a place where Lakshmi Nishingadev is worshipped. There's a place where Lord Nishingadev is killing Hiranyakashipu, and there's a number of places where sages have this vision of different pastimes there. So these are places that we can go. And of these forms, these are the forms which are the incarnations. If we can go, we can associate with these different incarnations. They're named differently according to the placement of the objects in their hand. And so the placement from the objects of the hand, it starts with the lower right hand, and then it goes to the upper right hand, and then the left hand, and then the lower left hand. And so in that order, Nishingadev's weapons are, he's holding the disc, the lotus, the club, and the conch. And so the disc and the lotus are sort of like the double-edged blessing, and the weapon in the same configuration with the conch and the lotus. You know, 2 weapons for, you know, protecting, and 2 weapons really for blessing. You know, blessing weapons like that. So that's what we have, is we have all these different Vishnu incarnations. And the first personal incarnation is Sankarshan. Sankarshan expansion is Purusha or Vishnu. And then it expands to 25 Leela avatars. And they perform different pastimes. Now, we had discussed previously in a different location that Buddha is on this list. And what's very interesting here is that this often is a list that people point to. It's very popular nowadays to say that Buddha can't be an incarnation of Vishnu, because Buddha predominantly is like the activities and the expansion of Buddhism is happening outside of India, even in countries that politically have adversarial relationships with India. And so there is like a popular line of thought that Buddha being an incarnation is a type of revisionism to the incarnation. But really, it's interesting because in the Bhagavatam, in this previous class that we discussed about Buddha, they give the Buddha incarnation, but it's not the, oh, is Buddha from Bodh Gaya? No, he's the old Buddha. But we discuss it actually in the Buddhist philosophy. There's Buddhas who are in the future waiting to be born as Buddha. That Buddha is like this constant thing. And that they give in the Bhagavatam a very interesting description of Buddha, which I will share here. It might not be that Buddha is just preaching to the atheists on earth, but here, when the atheists, being well-versed in the Vedic scientific knowledge, annihilated inhabitants of different planets, flying unseen in the sky, well-built rockets prepared by the great scientist Maya, the Lord will bewilder their minds by dressing himself attractively as Buddha and will preach on sub-religious principles to humans on other planets by flying there in rockets. It's Bhagavatam. And what is described by Sanatana Goswami is actually, that's not the Buddha that we know. That's a Buddha from a different cycle of time. That Buddha appears, but it's not that Buddha appears just once and it's like he's, preaching to the atheists and Southeast Asia, and it's not like that. That it's sort of broken down a little bit in the Das Avatar Stotram. That really, what is the mission of, say, an avatar like Buddha? Oh, Buddha, the compassionate heart, you decry the slaughter of the poor animals performing according to the rules of Vedic sacrifice. And in a lot of ways, this, even though it's our story of a different incarnation, it actually hits the main points of the Buddha avatar, is that it's decrying the slaughter or violence of the innocent by using Vedic technology and sub-religious principles as like a justification for it. So it's like a trick within a trick. But that Buddha's here, even listed in this list right here. That Prabhupada explains that these are the avatars. They appear in each day of Brahma or in each kalpa millennium. So the day of Brahma are these many, many cycles that come together, which are one full day of Brahma. And then the different minutes within the day of Brahma are more like the kalpas. They are sometimes known as kalpa avatars and other avatars like Hamsa. There's a swan avatar. And Mohini, the bewildering avatar that appears when they're churning the milk ocean and the poison comes out and the nectar of immortality, and she's able to get that to the demigods away from the thieves, from the Asuras who want to take that. And so they come like that. And that it's actually a matter of time. It really is a matter of time. There are manus, there are many manus that happen within the material worlds. We're not talking about just 5,000 years ago. We're talking about that this knowledge has been here for many manus, actually. And that this manu, this knowledge came into this manu, and that same knowledge had come down to the Bhagavad Gita. Like that. That chain, that knowledge had come down from Vaivashvika Manu, down, and then within the course of all these different kings and lineages and devastations and massive amounts of time, hundreds of thousands of millions of years of knowledge being destroyed and recreated and rebuilt, and the avatars coming and civilizations coming and going under one Manu. And then within a day of Brahma, many different Manus. And that's actually the story of humanity. It's not just a couple of temples that were buried a couple of thousand years ago, but those have ancients that came before them, and they had ancients that came before them. And then there were massive amounts of time when there was people just weren't around, like the Pratekas. They came out from meditating under the ocean, and there was no one around. Actually, at that time, the earth had overgrown with plants, and there was no one around, and they had to assist in repopulating the earth. So when we're talking about this stuff, it's actually this incredible amount of time, but an incredible amount of engagement over time, like that. It's described that they have different colors. So we know that there are different Varaha incarnations. It's not just Varaha, the boar incarnation, but there are actually different Varaha incarnations. Again, these stories of this continuous appearance of the Lord within creation. It's not just Varaha appears once in some ancient story a long time ago, but that had happened before also. It happened before also. And Lord Brahma, you can imagine some of this is happening in a day of Brahma. So it's like yesterday for Brahma. So just like you might have your highlight of your day, maybe some of his incarnations are like the highlight of Brahma's day. Then he goes on to describe the Shaktavesha avatar and this other particular form, because there's Leela avatars, Guna avatars, Leela avatars. He describes the many different types of avatars that there are. But that he describes also this one particular type is called the Shaktavesha avatar. And that's characterized into forms of divine absorption, Bhagavad Avesh, wearing of the absorption of the Lord, like the Piladev or Rishabdev, divinely empowered forms. Sheshnak, who's empowered to carry the world. Lord Brahman, power to create the cosmos. The four Kumaras, empowered to distribute transcendental knowledge. Narada Muni, empowered to distribute devotional service. Maharaj Prithu, he's empowered to specifically like rule the world. And actually the Maharaj Prithu story is really interesting in that it's all about reforming the world in some ways. He had to reform the entire world when he took the rule. So even like the ancient history involved with something like that. Thank you so much. And then Parashuram. And Parashuram, he wasn't specifically empowered to cut down the kings. And awesome, thank you so much. And that's an important story. I mean, when we talk about these Shaktavesha avatars, sometimes when we know about it, it's like, oh yeah, that's a lesser incarnation. Oh, it's just someone who's doing something, or it's not actually Vishnu. But these Shaktavesha avatars, like Parashuram is one of them. Prabhupada is preaching Krishna consciousness, but you almost can't get through a series of Prabhupada lectures or maybe 10 pages in Bhagavatam without really touching on some of these purports that have to do with how ancient cultures link back to like this Bhagavatam knowledge, and that real ancient cultures in the world link back. And that one of the stories that he gives, Prabhupada just describes really, is this Parashuram story. And Parashuram really picks up this story where there are different sons of Maharaj Yayati, and eventually they end up splitting into different lineages. And one of these lineages becomes a lineage that was sort of adversarial within the story, was kicked out of the family. And Parashuram appears and specifically is like purging that lineage. Is it 3 times, 7 times, 21 times? Purging this lineage. And Prabhupada describes that in the real world scenario of things, that was creating a exodus many thousands of years ago from India, multiple times, where these different kings with the Haya clan specifically were being driven out, these different Kshatriya kings, sort of kings that had become corrupted and against Vedic principles. He was like this powerful force to be reckoned with. And truly, even some of the oldest artifacts are axes. Like if you were to look at some of ancient artifacts and some of the earliest weapons, some of the earliest weapons and symbolism used in weapons are these weapons of axes. So Parashuram drove them out with this axe. And Prabhupada said that that's where they scattered. They scattered out of India, but they brought Vedic knowledge out of India. They went to Greece, Anatolia, Turkey, like this area Prabhupada describes, specifically that this lineages being driven out by Parashuram, that they were actually like very instrumental. So we can see that the Shaktavesha avatar, just along that line of thinking, isn't just doing nothing. They're not just creating good vibes on the earth, although that maybe that they're specifically empowered for that job of creating good vibes on the earth, in which case it's the best vibes ever because it's Vishnu or Krishna. But that there's an element of change that the Shaktavesha avatars can bring. There are innumerable incarnations of Krishna. There is no possibility of counting them. We can simply indicate them by giving the example of the moon and the branches of a tree. Although the moon appears to be located in the branches of the tree, it is actually situated very far away. So if we're looking at the tree, you can see the moon is in the tree. Similarly, none of the avatars and incarnations of the Lord are within this material world, but they are visible by the causeless mercy of the Lord. We should not consider them to belong to this material world. So just staying on this idea of the Shaktavesha avatar, because it's also in line with Easter in a sense too, because Srila Prabhupada likened the activities of Jesus, also interestingly, to that of Shaktavesha avatar. And I'll just set that up by saying that Lord Chaitanya says, just try to understand the meaning of the Shaktavesha avatar. There are unlimited Shaktavesha avatars of Lord Krishna. Let me describe the chief of them. Empowered incarnations are of two types, primary and secondary. The primary one is directly empowered by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and that's called an incarnation. The secondary one is indirectly empowered by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, called Vibhuti. Some Shaktavesha avatars are the four Kumaras, Narada, Prithu, Parasaram. When a living being is empowered to act as Lord Brahma, he is also considered a Shaktavesha avatar. And I wanted to dig into that a little bit. And what is that Shaktavesha avatar, and how does that relate to Christianity? And so I just wanted to pull out what maybe the other acharyas had said. I know Srila Prabhupada had said some stuff, but I was really curious. In 1871, Bhaktivinoda Thakur had written an essay called Love of God, in which he describes Jesus is inspired. And Jesus is, he has a quote, and it says, love God with all thy heart, thy mind, and thy soul, and with all thy strength and love as my brother. And he considered that as an absolute truth, that love for thy neighbor is an absolute truth. But he went on to describe in the article that actually these are just different varieties of rasa, and that the different spiritual teachers are actually teaching this idea of rasa, called it expanded rasa. But then he goes on to say that until now, though, this rasa has not crossed beyond India. Recently, a scholar from England named Newman realized something about this and wrote a book about it. The people of Europe and America, and this is the father of the modern Sankirtan. This is the father of the reason, this vision is the reason, not this quote, the vision of this person is the reason why we have ISKCON temples all around the world. The vision of this person. So the people of Europe and America have not been satisfied with what Salya Ras mixed with opulence as preached by Jesus Christ. So there's God the Father mixed with this interplay of like Jesus sometimes described as like the King of Kings, or like, you know, they interplay this, he's like a poor man, but he's like a king or something like that. So actually Bhaktivinoda Thakur is tuning into this idea and he's labeling it that it's like a Vatsalya Ras mixed with this interplay of opulence preached by Jesus Christ. And I hope by the grace of the Lord in a very short time, they will be attached to drinking the intoxicating nectar of Madhurya Ras. It has been seen that any Ras that appears in India eventually spreads to the Western countries. Therefore, Madhurya Ras will soon be preached throughout the world, just as the sun rises in India and gradually spreads its light to the West. The Acharya that followed him viewed Jesus as the Jagat Guru, but really questioned that if someone accepts the great soul from the past, as in the case of Jesus as a Jagat Guru, and wishes to follow in his footsteps in the present, but considers that there's no need for like the living tradition of the gurus in your life, it is questionable to what extent he'll actually be able to properly follow the example of Jesus. On the succession of these gurus mercifully delivers us the words of the Supreme Lord, or the Jagat Guru, the different acharyas. He explains that just like a river flowing from the mountain has tributaries that come off in, like they could experience it in Navadvip, and they can actually touch the same river, that you need almost like tributaries and traditions that come off from that. And the teachings preached by Jesus 2,000 years ago are not carried forward through Guru Parampara to the present time. If Jesus' message isn't sought only in the books and recorded instructions, and there's a possibility that we will mistakenly accept distortions of truth. And so really that even though there's change in the world and that this philosophy, right, coming into the world, Purtranaya Saranam Vinashaya Chaduskritam Dhammastam Starpana, that he's protecting the devotees, establishing religious principles, and annihilating the miscreants, like that. It leaves a mark in the world, but without the living traditions, then that mark might be missed, actually. So it's a 2x2 thing. The incarnations are coming, but it's the traditions that maintain it. And then finally, Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada said that he considered the Shaktavesha piece to really be about that he's empowered to be a Vaishnava. He's not a Vaishnava, but he's actually exhibiting what a Vaishnava is. And he gives the example of like something like Easter, that he sacrificed himself in order to spread sort of love of God and remove the suffering of the world. But shame on the world for not following up with that and allowing that just to happen, and everyone continues on their merry way like that. The consecutive pastimes of Krishna are manifest in one of the innumerable universes, moment after moment. There is no possibility of counting the universes, but in any case, some pastime of the Lord is being manifested every moment in one universe or another. Thus, the Lord's pastimes are flowing like Ganges water. In this way, all the pastimes are manifested by the son of Maharaj Nanda. Like that. Just like the sun, there is an orbit to Krishna's pastimes, which are manifested one after another during the lifetime of the 14 Manus. This orbit expands through the universe and gradually it returns. Then Krishna moves with his pastimes through all the universes, one after another, like a transcendental roadshow. Krishna is always moving into the different universes and the different Brahmas. We might not see Krishna's pastimes, but they're taking place everywhere, and that these incarnations are constantly interacting with the world. Sanatana Goswami asks here, how do you know an incarnation? And it's a clever question. Prabhupada describes as an important question, because Lord Chaitanya describes that you have to listen to the sadhus. There's a color to them. You have to listen to the descriptions of the Shastra, and you have to listen to the sadhus who know. And it's considered an interplay, because Sanatana Goswami was implying that he himself was talking to an incarnation of the Lord. But Lord Chaitanya said, but an incarnation is not going to say I'm God. He's not going to say I'm God. So Lord Chaitanya was answering this question, implying that you can understand the incarnation by seeing the incarnation. But he himself is not describing himself as the incarnation. But Sanatana Goswami is actually, through these descriptions, realizing, like, truly, and he did, just by embracing him, they experienced ecstatic symptoms. That. So we can wrap it up. Sanatana Goswami the cycle of the pastimes turns like a wheel of fire. Thus Krishna exhibits his pastimes one after another in every universe. They're perfect, more perfect, and most perfect, the pastimes. And in this way, Krishna's transcendental forms are expanded unlimitedly. No one can count them. Whatever I've explained is simply a glimpse. It is like showing the moon, again, through the branches of the trees. So we can understand that. We can understand that the Lord's pastimes are actually astonishing, and they're unlimited. And that if they're not astonishing, then what are we doing? Because by definition, even the pastime of Nrsimhadev, it's astonishing. It's amazing, the incarnation, but the variety and the fact that even the incarnations come again and again and again, and there's still variety. It's not like, oh, Varaha is appearing again. No, it's a different Varaha. It's a different aspect of Varaha, like that. And so we can meditate on that, and we can also meditate on how these incarnations affected our world, but also how we can learn from them, and also we can also glimpse the incarnations of the Bhagavatam, incarnations that Vyasadeva gave us, literature, and of course chanting Harinam, which is the incarnation of the sound of Krishna's name. So any sound in the material world is actually also an emanation, an expansion of that original sound of Krishna. So we can meditate on these things as we're approaching our avatar seasons, and we're hearing about the different pastimes of the Lord, and allow ourselves to be astonished like Narada. Look for the nectar in Krishna's pastime, the variety there. There's not much time for questions, but does anyone have any questions about the topic of avatars or astonishment? I remember one time one of those like laser lights were like on the sidewalk, and everyone was around and looking at the laser going on the sidewalk. He was a devotee, and he's like, and it's so funny. He goes, and I just stand in front of the deities, and I just like have such a lack of appreciation like that. But somehow in the world, this laser on the sidewalk and everyone's like, oh my God, I can't believe it. This is incredible. Yeah. So we got to train our eyes a little bit and accept the astonishment of the Lord. Also not fight over it. If the Lord exhibits pastimes which are astonishing or seemingly contradictory, it keeps it in the center of conversation, but it's not something that we should fight over, because we should know that actually the Lord is manifesting himself. He's not manifesting himself in a contrary way. It's actually the Lord. So we have to look to see the Lord hiding there in that incarnation like that. Like Prahlad. Prahlad worshipped Govinda. That was Prahlad's worshipable deity. He wasn't praying, please, Lord Nrsingadev, come protect me. Lord Nrsingadev came to protect Prahlad. But Prahlad was praying to Govinda, and he wasn't afraid of Lord Nrsingadev because he could see Govinda. He could see that actually it was his worshipable Lord like that. So, and that's the way we can train our eyes to, our hearts, to accept the Lord when he appears with astonishment. Hare Krishna. So we're going to have a beautiful darshan with Shri Radha Gopi Vallabha. And also just a note to everybody at home, the temple is now open for Sunday programs, so you can come to the temple. We have some nice devotees here, and we'll have to go prasadam for you when you leave. But it's a wonderful opportunity to come together and have these kirtans, like as a group. It's a really powerful opportunity and part of the training, I think, of being together like that. So, okay, well, we'll stop here. Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu ki jai, Shri Prabhupada ki jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Hare Krishna.
Namaste Naradrinaya. Tanya Kashe Purvasha. Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare. Krishna, Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, dear devotees. Thank you for coming to our Sunday Feast program. As you all know, we have opened our temple on all days. So you can come to temple anytime, any day. On Saturdays, Sundays, unlike in the past, the temple darshan is open for the whole day. So we can come anytime. Because on Saturdays, it used to be closed from 12:30 to 4 o'clock. But nowadays, since pandemic, we have kept it open the whole day. So you can take advantage of that, the whole day darshan. And on the weekdays, you can come, during the darshan time. Except 12:30 to 4 o'clock, we do not have darshan. That is the time we should avoid. But otherwise, other times you can come for the darshan. And we are also there in the morning, since morning for 4:45 a.m. If anybody wants to come for the morning darshan, then our morning program can come in. So first of all, I would like to thank all the devotees who have been sponsoring our feast for the past few days. Because devotees are not able to come for whatever reason. So, however, they have been supporting us online, either by attending online sessions or by sending us some donations. So we would like to thank all the devotees. We had a few of the devotees who have been supporting us for the past few days. We would like to thank Rachna Das, Karavich, Suresh Babu, Anu Mataji has sponsored the Ramnami decoration flowers, and as well as she has sponsored the Ramnami feast as well. We have Shukumar Pillai. We also have Lokhandi. Vishal Kola. We have Sharwani Mataji, Sharwani Purnala, Rahul Damisha, who has been regularly sponsoring us. We have Sanjay Prabhu, who helped us in setting up this entire mic. You can see that our sound system here at the temple is updated here and all the new instruments there. So we discuss all the good things, not that there's a sound system. Otherwise, what happens is that all the setup gets disturbed and it becomes difficult to again set it up. So we have to wait for Sanjay Prabhu. It is very precious time for him to actually take off, especially on the weekends and also on the weekdays. He's tired of his work. So please do not touch the sound system unless and until if somebody from the management asks him. We also have Ramana Prabhu, who has sponsored the feast, and also we have Shettigar, Pratibha Shettigar. We have Santosh Avari and Suhas Gavnish Rajkumar, Abhay Dogra, Rakesh Mehra, Ranjan Mehra, and Akshay Patil, Akshay Kashyap. So these are the devotees who have sponsored in the past few days. We would like to express our gratitude and pray the Guru Spirit of Sri Radha by chanting one Hare Krishna Mahamantra. So please join with me in chanting the Mahamantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Also like to thank Express for giving us this class and sparing some time today. Yes, we also came yesterday and again we came today, and it's a long weekend. It's very unusual to expect the devotees on the long weekend. Thank you for coming. Hare also and also we have Isha Prabhu, who came for both days, Saturday and Sunday. Hare Bo. All the devotees who came for the both days. Thank you once again. We also would like to thank all the cooks who have cooked yesterday and today. So we have our cook, Lakshman Prabhu, and also we have Krishna Prabhu, who helped us cooking for both days. So we would like to also express our gratitude. Then by love, we can think that okay, so once it just all the devotees, there is a lot of opportunity for the services at the temple. So if you are interested in helping us out, or you want to do the devotional service, you want to know how these operations have been performed here at the temple, then please try to see us. We engage in various kinds of services. So there are various admin services, there are operational services, there are accounting services, there are pujari services, there are various types of pujari, there are kitchen services, and various other festival services, unlimited festival services. And you will find that whatever skills you have, we make sure that you are engaged in a proper way. So that's our specialty. That's what we do that. So whatever devotees are good at it, we try to engage them in those kinds of services. Because temple needs so much of management, temple needs a lot of operational activities, a lot of operational help. So we need devotees for those services. So please see if you are interested. We would love to engage you. We would like to help you be part of this transformative process. Thank you once again. Hare Krishna. There's a prasadam outside. There's a prasadam outside. It's a Guru prasadam. It will take a few more weeks for us to restart again the prasadam meeting at the temple. But for now, I think let's go with the Tugu prasadam. So please pick the place of prasadam outside. Yeah, thank you once again. Hare Krishna.
Jai. Hari Hari Bol.
Those who want to stay, they can stay until 8:30. We have 8:30 to 8:45. That's the last night. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.